This is Varsha Ravichandran. I am a junior sustainability consultant at Turner and Townsend. And today we are joined by Lewis Hyde, who's a consultant with Turner and Townsend. So this is going to be a masterclass. So the purpose of this event is this is a retrofit information, support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. Now over to Lewis to take over the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Varsha, and welcome everyone. So, yeah, as Varsha said, my name's Louise. I'm a consultant at Turner Townsend with Rise. And yeah, I've now got about 6.5 years in working in sustainability roles. And most of that has actually been in retrofit and energy projects, normally domestic properties. So, excited to bring that experience to the session. So, first of all, we're going to start with a little bit on, if you've not heard of it, the Mobilisation Confidence Assessment and MCA. This is an offer for tailored one-to-one support. And then to talk you through the gaining assurance agenda for the supply chain, we have various different stages of that. We've got it in the procurement stage and then in the contract management stage, and then things you can do around sort of more informal project management aspects with the team, and then moving on to how you can do quality assurance, different types of quality assurance. So the session is designed for sort of grant recipients or people delivering retrofit projects rather than the supply chain themselves. But of course, that's not to say that it can't just be useful to understand both sides. This is designed to help you know how to interact with what sort of stages that might be useful and how to break it down into manageable chunks. So I'm not going to spend too long on this slide. There's a few acronyms. I'll try to do my best to actually just explain things, each one in full as I go along, but this will be sent in a copy with the slides that you'll get as well. A few sort of procurement terminologies we'll go through, and there we go. So the first bit we have is about reliability in the procurement stage. So realise there might be quite a few different audiences in the call today of maybe you're already in procurement or maybe you're just about to go out to procurement. So some things to understand or talk about is that we have invitations to tenders on IT, and that you could design pre-qualifying a questionnaire, and in a pre-qualifying questionnaire, a PQQ, you could set out sort of minimum thresholds of things that are important to you for your retrofit project. We'd probably say for some of the government schemes, such as warmer homes, there are some really key considerations, such as being able to install to PAS 2030, 2023, or any MCS micro certification schemes. And if you have anything other standards, such as you'll need to be familiar with Trustmark lodgements, you might have levels of insurances as well that are specific to you, or you might have that they only can install these measures to a certain standard. You could set pre-qualifying questionnaire items, and then that means that maybe then you're only looking at the ones that kind of meet that threshold potentially. But then if you want to be more open and understand how you can work with sort of smaller installers who maybe need help gaining those certifications, that could be something you can decide kind of at a local level. But normally for the government funded schemes such as warm homes, there is those standards, which I'm going to go into a bit later anyway. Also, just to familiarise yourself with the new regulations that came into place in February. So again, there'll be a mixture of audiences. If you're already on a framework, you might be working to the Public Contract Regulations 2015. However, the new ones that went live in February, that's the Public Procurement Act 2023. There are things in there that have changed from being like the most economically advantageous tender, so MEET, to MAT, which is now the most advantageous tender, looking into different aspects, such as realising that not just the economic aspects, but thinking about wider impacts of social value and so on. But the assurance you can do here can be that you're looking for someone who's maybe familiar with government reporting schemes and that they have experience in that area, or if that's not important to you, for them to have that experience, but you can maybe help them and work with them on it. You might not want to rely, suppliers who maybe just haven't done that before. And you could even ask them, for examples, and really making sure that your scope is really specific to this project, saying that you're going to need this many homes per month or this many measures per month, that they will need to be qualified to certain standards, and so on. That can just help you gain confidence and assurance in that. You can also go around this a little bit less formally before you go out to an invitation to tender. You can do some soft market testing and start to go out to either soft market testing directly to suppliers and ask or contractors, installers, tier one, tier two, tier three contractors. You could go directly to them and start asking them, what's your experience and so on. Or you could start to get in contact with other grant recipients who have delivered retrofit projects similar to what you're doing just now. So, historically, there's been other ones like LAD and Hug and things. So maybe you could go and ask them. You could either go for your local area and look for ones that are delivered in your area, or you could look for ones similar housing associations of or similar councils of a similar size, or you could start to find someone who has a very similar like archetype to your properties. So there's so many different things that you could start to approach them, or it could be a consortium and ask them, how did you go about this? How did you find it? What worked for you? Did you have any issues with any installers, and how did you overcome that? Mentioned that briefly there, that you might want to do insurance, financial credit checks, insurance, and so on. Your procurement team and so on can help you with professional indemnity insurance, public liability insurance, some legal advisor. So you would need to talk to your procurement teams on that one. But you can have certain thresholds. Companies tend to hold certain thresholds that they look for, and that can also be a part of an onboarding bit. So there's the home specific ones past 2035, 2023 and past 2030, Trustmark and MCS. There might also be some sort of wider things that you're maybe, if you're a council, housing association, that you maybe look for in other projects that you'll be familiar with all these terms, but like safeguarding DBS checks or the LOLA regulations, lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations, working at height, asbestos and things. These might be other parts that you would start to look for, and obviously the installer is going to prepare risk and method statements, the RAMs as well. We have the Procurement Act 2023, so that went live in February. And the benefits that this is designed is to be just a lot more flexible. It's trying to make it more open to suppliers. Also, with the traditional framework, I think the traditional ones, everyone kind of got onboarded at a certain point, and then kind of once you were on that last certain years. I think with the new regulations, it's designed to be a little bit like people can be onboarded throughout the duration of the framework, making it a bit more accessible and things, and trying to make that business opportunities more open for sort of smaller, medium suppliers and help them progress and kind of understand that if we need a market to deliver retrofit and scale that up, we need installers to be able to grow in that space and have the opportunity to grow. And a little reminder here in your procurement stages that every home's unique. And although we can talk about pre-qualification sort of recommendations and thresholds and things, every single home essentially is going to need its own approach and its own retrofit assessment. So understanding that could throw up different requirements. I'm now going to move on to the contract stage. So what types of things that you could do to gain assurance from the supply chain in the contract stage. So gaining assurance, you can do this through really formal items such as in your contract management, the service level agreement. And a service level agreement can outline the level of service and deliverables, and that can cover a wide variety of different things, really. It can be the meeting attendance, monthly reporting, payment timelines. So you could say that you have to pay us within an X date of a certain month, or you have to pay us within X date of submission of that document. You can also look at any satisfaction scores, such as, that they're going to complete their own resident satisfaction surveys and that they have to report those scores to you and things. And response times, so you might put in service level agreements around that they have to communicate a complaint to you within X days and things. So generally speaking, I think there's another side we're going to get into on even more examples that some of which I've maybe just covered there. But generally speaking, your service level agreement, you're wanting to cover the quality that's expected, how you expect them to work, things like the project management, the risk management, the payments. Really, this is about quality and making sure that how would you then go back on if something wasn't done to the quality and the standard you expected, or the payment wasn't made on time, or you had a complaint from the install? that should then go back to, you should be able to check your service level agreement and say, that says here that it was meant to be done to this standard and it's not been done to this standard. So, why this kind of shouldn't have happened. But then, you know, we do other sort of sessions actually on sort of more around resolutions of these types of things. So that's maybe a different session. But the service level agreement is to sort of stop and things kind of becoming an issue and to make sure it's a quality standard. And you might have different terms on how long that contract lasts and when you want to look at the sort of the dates and when you might refresh it. So formalizing things in a service level agreement, you probably heard of the term before, but the KPIs. This is something that, these schemes have their own KPI, the monthly reporting requirements, and appreciate it might not be absolutely set in stone yet, but it's going to be generally speaking around things like the number of homes delivered per month, number of surveys done, and number of pre-install surveys or number of lodgements made. It's that type of thing. And the KPIs, you might have that integrated in, but there'll also be other things that you might have that are personal to your own project. Especially if you're doing the social housing fund, you might have co-funding that well, you will have co-funding, but you might be doing above and beyond things in that project that you might want to add into this. So you might want to have number of customer satisfaction or baseline or checks and additional things that you might want in. But what I would say in this respect is you might want to start drafting up, what does your ideal monthly report look like? Imagine what in the perfect world, if a supplier was going to deliver this report to you, a monthly report, what do you want it to look like? What's going to be on there? Think about, what do you need to have and what do you want to have? What does your senior manager want to see? What does the grant funder want to see? And then also probably think about the formats that's going to be in. So are you going to have live access to that? I don't think you really want to be sort of requesting the monthly report from your supplier every month by email, being like, where is this report? I think it should be something that's agreed that you're going to get it on X date of the month, or X date from this, or X date from that. Now, I have covered a few of these examples, but let's just discuss these a little bit more. Just some examples of service level agreements. You might outline that your retrofit assessment has to be uploaded to a SharePoint in X number of days or X days from this point, that complaints have to be reported to you from you as a grant recipient. If there's any complaints with a supplier, they've got to tell you about it within an X time frame, or that we're looking to resolve it in these time frames. But then you might have a sort of annex or a subsequently linked complaints handling policy as well. Setting out the monthly reporting requirements, ideally that should be, communicated quite formally in the contract to say that you will adhere to some sort of monthly reporting requirements that are expected to be X, Y, Z on these dates. Appreciate some things are not completely set in stone yet, but hopefully you get the general idea. The number of installs to be agreed. So let's say that's something that's quite important to both parties as well, that from your point of view, you're, as a grant recipient, you're looking to deliver to what you said you're going to do in the grant funding agreement and your grant proposal. Also, that contractor wants to know that they're going to get the guaranteed amount of homes that they were promised from a sort of financial point of view, as they've already put lots of work in to go hire those installers and check their insurances and get them on their sort of systems. So they've already hired them on the basis that they're going to install X amount of homes. So you might want to set up agreements then on, if there's any sort of variation from that, how you handle that, and whether that variation system can be in place, and that can be that if you go above or below, that there's some sort of mechanism. And customer feedback scores yet to be uploaded to a SharePoint. So yeah, this could be that's really transparent. There's a difference really by saying that someone's going to do something that you want the installer to go out and get customer feedback. There's a difference between you agreeing informally that you will do that, and to actually assuring that it's been done, that it's gone onto a SharePoint within X time frame, and that you can access that. And then you might decide that you want to then decide if it goes below a certain score, that you do something of some kind. The QA process, so there could be different steps. It could be even in sort of fraud aspects as well, but you have all these different steps on how do you expect the installer to quality assure the work that they've done themselves, and then how are you going to quality assure the work that they've done, and also potentially sampling of, okay, so the installer can get feedback from the customers but then you could also sample some customer feedback as well of how they found the installer and kind of take your own word for it as well. And that could be something you could look into. And again, invoices to be paid within a certain amounts of working days is usually something that I think you'll probably be actually quite familiar with, not just in the retrofit contract, with any contract. That's really a normal thing to have. And with retrofit, it can be sometimes to do with, when it's lodged on the portals, and that can affect the grant funding drawdowns. And there'll be lots more information on that and all the guidance. But yeah, once how the grant funding can be drawn down, and basically trigger points of, is it when it's lodged, is it when you've done that survey, is it when that survey is complete. There are other sort of informal aspects that you can do in terms of quality assurance and supply chain, and this can be the sort of training and the evidence sort of workshops at the beginning of the contract, setting up all these mechanisms that how you're going to deal with things. And I'm not going to spend too long on that, so I'm going to go on to the next one. And that could be things like the pre-start meetings that you do at the beginning of a project. So you've set up a service level agreement, or that's kind of going to be discussed. So how can you then get this in place to understand what project teams, how you're all going to operate? And then you can do a QA process, understanding that you've set up your service level agreement, you've set up some project pre-start meetings, and then what's the QA process going to be? How can you check that they're aware of any critical path in the project, that they've confirmed the KPIs, and how are they showing they'll monitor it? So what are they doing in weekly or monthly project meetings, and who's involved in those, who's all attending? And then what any consequences of any missed targets, if there's anything in the SLA around if you start to miss targets or there's variations, what's the process? We do have a session actually which goes into a lot more detail about like contract variation. Then we have things like the ongoing quality assurance checks that you can do, and different steps you can do on this, different approaches to it. So generally speaking, supply chain sort of risks that you might crop up with, it could be things with the install itself, like the quality of the install, residents dropping out because they're not sure about when the appointment is, or the appointment time, or it was cancelled or moved and they feel like they've kind of been messed around with appointments or things. Tidiness after an install, or kind of work's been done that they didn't know were going to happen because it's not been clearly communicated. So, they think that they're getting cavity wall insulation, or usually it's the other way around. They maybe hope that they're getting solar panels, and then they turn up and they're getting something completely different, or they weren't sure about ventilation. So I think there's lots of things there that you can do, and a lot of that actually comes back to resident engagement and marketing and the communications. So if you have that on a risk register, you can have, the risk is that the residents don't sign up in the first place, or that there's dropout. The dropout, the cause of those risks can be things like they weren't aware that there was going to be a ventilation requirement, or they weren't aware that that they were getting measure X, they thought they were getting measure Y. There's things like that you can just do in marketing and make it really clear and make that a requirement of your contractors. Staff sort of resources and leave, if you've got subcontractors working, and how they manage that, and kind of also the geography of how you're covering that wide. If you've got a wide area, your properties are quite spread out, how can you manage this? There's actually just the practicalities of the installers having to drive around and go to different sites all the time, and that resource feeling like they're not rushed at the visits and things. So how can you manage that? Maybe you can put some terms in place that you're trying to cover certain catchment areas, or if it's beyond certain hours, then you've got maybe like grouped your properties into sort of manageable chunks of areas and timescales as well. Budgets, financial risk. So hopefully this is something that, at the very, very beginning in your procurement exercises and the onboarding, that you have done sort of credit financial checks on the company, but not to say that things cannot start to change. So you could have, the installer's financial position, that potentially could change, or what the project just sort of increases in cost in various ways. That type of stuff is kind of where we want to go, again, back to the contract management procurement stages, that you've agreed that if there's any change in cost, that there's an agreement and a contract variation process in place. And then stakeholders and compliance. So how are you going to check? There's a lot of sort of GDPR and legal aspects, and how can you kind of quality assure this and check these things are in place. I'd probably suggest, yeah, that you kind of have someone responsible for QA and regular meeting points and processes in place to understand that. There's also then understanding the compliance of the schemes in general, the UK building regulations, any local authority sign-offs, maybe for planning permission, and checking percentages of work, any planning regulations, and the health and safety. And then these might be your sort of general ones to consider that you might already be quite familiar with, you know, going back to the working at heights regulations and asbestos and so on. These are things that you can work out in your RAMs and make it clear with the installer and the onboarding as well. And then for warm homes specifically, we have, again, just a reminder, it's all got to be, installers must be Trustmark registered and certified under the latest versions of PAS, PAS 2035, 2023 version, and then there's the PAS 2030 install standards as well, keeping up to date with any procurement regulations that you need to comply with, public procurement regulations, making sure that that is all checked. I think as well, just one thing, if your procurement does run out if you're having to extend any contracts or re-procure anything mid-project, is to really have that identified in project plans, all reminders, anything that's going to lapse, any insurances that are going to lapse, if your framework ends at a certain point, is that you've set up all these reminders and you've got someone responsible monitoring that the company are going to send you the renewed insurance well before the existing one runs out, so that you've not got this big gap where they're not uninsured or anything like that. It's to make sure all these things are in place, and it can be done in really easy, manageable things, just like reminders and having someone responsible, and it marked out on the project plan as to when the insurance runs out or so on, or when the framework runs out. And then you work back. Framework runs out in September. It's going to work back and understand when I need to start procuring. QA methods. So we're going to go into a few different approaches and techniques you could do. Interested to know in the discussion in a bit, kind of what works for you, what you've tried. So satisfaction surveys are really important. Also, as part of PAS, you've got to do the post-monitoring evaluation. So you could maybe tie stuff like that into that. I would probably say how you want to, residents can get quite fatigued with all these different surveys, and an installer comes in and they've had the retrofit assessor in and they've had the retrofit coordinator in, and it can maybe be a bit overwhelming. So I'd just, if you can, streamline things and that you can make sure that whenever you're doing that check that they're kind of bundled, maybe bundled into a bit of a handover, or you're doing that when you're doing other things, just so they're not getting fatigued, if possible. So you can, how's the installer going to check their own work? How are you going to check the installer's work? How's the installer going to check that the customer's happy? How are you going to check that the customer is happy with the installer? And so on. And for me, that's kind of about, well, the whole experience can be split up into different things. You can be really, really happy like with how the solar panel looks or the quality of the solar panel, but maybe you weren't happy with how your appointment was booked. Maybe you weren't happy with how your eligibility was checked. So for me, it's about breaking it down and understanding, because if you just ask them as a whole, how happy are you with the service, or how happy are you with the project, and they give you, what if they give you like a 2 out of 5? How do you know whether that 2 out of 5 is from that, or is that to do with the contractor? Is that to do with you? Is that to do with the managing agent? I think this is where the balance between understanding where what they're happy with versus over fatiguing them is, trying to get that balance. And I think creating a really, really simple but thought through survey and getting that survey QA'd by various members of your team, and maybe ask someone who's not involved with the project, can you QA this from your a neutral point of view? Imagine you're a homeowner who's had this done, or a social housing tenant who's had this project done. From your perspective, does the survey make sense? I'm sure we've all had this at times. Sometimes you fill out a survey and you do think to yourself, I feel like this survey just, it doesn't really make sense. So it's, are you happy with the team or who booked your appointment? Brackets, this was, insert name of contractor. Or were you happy with the council? And just making it really clear, if there's a few different parties going on, making it really clear that you're asking about that or the next thing. The home visits, drop-ins, yeah, I suppose there's some things that you might not get from filling out a survey or a form. If they're happy to have sort of home visit, you might tie it into like a case study or a testimonial visit. That could be something you could do, and maybe that's like a more personal experience sort of thing. But please do bear in mind, they might not feel that. Some people would feel really comfortable giving you feedback that actually, do you know what, I wasn't really happy with this, I wasn't really happy with that face to face. But then you don't want to sort of accidentally skew your results and have them feeling like they can't tell you that in person. So just have a think about, how are they going to be most open? How am I going to get the most reliable results? And this is not about really like any sort of blame or shame or anything. It's just understanding, what are they happy with, what aren't they happy with, so that you can improve things in the future if they weren't. Yeah, and I would also say if you could have, say, for example, I having someone else collate that feedback of how that person was. So, for example, instead of me asking how were you happy with my masterclass, someone else can ask how were you happy with Louise's masterclass, for example, or installer, the council can check how happy the resident was with the installer and so on. Then things like mystery shoppers, this can be phoning into like the call center bit and sort of having a test experience and seeing how it handled. Some of you may have really sort of mature experience managing agents with quite fancy CRMs, and it might show you like, oh, we had this many calls and the call durations were this time, and you might be logging like the call categories into different categories and have quite fancy, because telecommunication system and software can be really, really mature and show you all these analytics. So that could be really insightful, really, as to what people are actually calling about. So that could be an interesting one, mystery shopper, or you could even just do what's the word, kind of like a role play thing, and work with each other and pretend that, well, what if I'm this customer and I'm coming up to you with this problem? What would you do? And that could be a good like team building exercise, is just pretend as a team and say, for example, I could pretend to be a really angry customer, and I could go up to someone in my team and say, I'm really not happy with the quality of the install. They've come in, they were late, they've made a mess, and this, that, and the next thing. And then you can get your team member to sort of reply and say, how would they reply? How would they reply to that, and how would they respond to that? And then part of that can also be like, if there is an issue, also almost deciding who the responsibility lies with to rectify anything, and part of understanding who that responsibility lies with to rectify anything if you need to is really understanding which bit they were unhappy with, so you can assign who has to rectify it. Satisfaction surveys, yep, part of you might want to do this as a sort of basic, but you might want to do a more advanced survey. You might be asking things like, do you feel like your well-being's improved, or do you feel more comfortable at home, or your thermal comfort, or do you feel like the less financial pressure? Some of you might be going into detail like that, or you might be doing kind of more things. Some of you might be working with research partners with the university. There's so many different things. Please do share your experiences of how you're finding this and how it's worked for you. Bear in mind things like GDPR. You don't want to sort of realise that you wish you'd done a survey, but you can't because the project's over, it's past a certain time frame. Talk to your GDPR data protection officers and understand like, what can you ask, how long can you hold the data for, things like that. Auditing and performance reporting. So yeah, on site kind of audits and things, you might want to do samples, really kind of things that are good to do really early on, just to understand like what's actually going on, what if there's delays or there's issues, what's happening here. And this could be something that the installer can have already put in their contract that they do themselves. They might invite you along, or you might set up your own kind of requirement for that. Again, excited to hear kind of how people do this and how they find it. Now I'm just going to move on to a few more final bits, really. So essentially, again, ensure assurance in your supply chain can be done in a few different ways: through the procurement, through the service level agreements or contract management, through sort of informal aspects like team meetings and team training and things. Training is really important here. I feel like we've just talked quite a lot about, I say we've talked quite a lot, I've talked quite a lot about how all these things we need to do, but training is a really big part of that, making sure the team feel comfortable, because the team, all parts of the team, project team, installers, if you're asking them to be comply with things like fraud management, GDPR, technical standards, and risk statements, asbestos, and things like that. Some of those terms are quite scary or safeguarding, and it's not, we can't be unfair here in asking them. There should be training provided and on all these things to help them do their role properly, and understanding them, asking them, what do you feel you need to do properly to do your role? Do you feel confident doing it? And obviously as well, kind of making sure they've got the training before they start doing these things. But yeah, we've got the contract management side of things, procurement side of things, informal things that you can do. And then the quality assurance side of things is, how are you going to go and check all that? I feel like that's hopefully a good summary bit of it. I'm going to move on to resources in a minute, but I will just do a final recap of things today. So how can you gain assurance from the procurement stage and the invitation to tender, and your pre-qualifying questionnaires, making sure all the pre-qualifying checks are, you've got the technical assurance that you need, anything to do with PAS and so on, and then you've kind of got the more operational side of things, any insurances, how are you maybe checking their credit checks and things like that. And then we had things like the assurance and reliability in the contract stage. So we had things like service level agreements. What would you want to include in there? So it could be, please pay us by the invoice by this date. Please upload your retrofit assessments by this date. Please put XYZ onto the Share portal, SharePoint. And then we had things about pre-start meetings and how you can check that they're happy with things. And then we moved on to QA methods that you can do, so home visits or mystery shopper satisfaction surveys and auditing and reporting. And you could do, a mixture of these, and just bear in mind what you would need to do to comply with PAS 2035 monitoring evaluation as well, and can you tie it into some of this. So that's everything I was going to say on the gaining assurance, really. And now I'm just going to finish off. Just a reminder, we do have resources on the website, so the RISE website. We have toolkits, we've got podcasts, masterclasses. Thank you, and I'll hand over to you, Varsha.
Thanks, Louise. That was a very extensive presentation. I hope all of you enjoyed and learned something new.